Using layer styles the right way. Layer styles are a great way of improving your designs, but they're so easy to misuse that I've decided to talk about them in detail. First, the drop shadow. Oh, the lovely drop shadow. The main problem I see in most designs is it's way too strong. Drop shadows should be very subtle, barely noticeable. You never want the user to clearly see it. You want it there to provide better contrast, to create a sense of depth, of perspective, but it should never be in your face. Let's go through some of the settings and I'll show you the most common situations where you might use it. First, I'd like to talk about the angle, which is by default set at 120 degrees. The following thing applies to all layer styles, not just drop shadow, so keep that in mind. When you have global lighting checked, that means there's a single source of light in your entire canvas. That means you can't have some shadows going to the right and some to the left, because that would mean multiple sources of light. The idea is this. You can have several drop shadows applied, and then if you change the lighting angle at 90 degrees, for example, every drop shadow is going to change to that. It's an interesting feature, but to tell you the truth, you'll most likely never use it. The problem is that when you move your elements to another canvas, say if you want to export them or reuse them in another project, your new document will have its angle set at 120, thus changing your design. That's not a tragedy, but I recommend you uncheck global lighting and manually input all angles depending on your desired effect. For text, 90 degrees might work best, but for buttons you might want to use 120. This requires an individual setting for each element. Global lighting wouldn't allow that. You can of course change the default angle, but that still doesn't solve the problem. So again, I suggest you uncheck that option. Regarding the blending mode for the drop shadow, I only use two states, either normal or multiply. Let me show you how I use the normal blending mode to create some buttons. First, draw a rectangle and have it in any color you want. Then add a drop shadow with 100% opacity, normal blending mode, 90 angle, 5 distance, and 0 for spread and size. Then change the color from black to a darker nuance than what you've used for your button. And that's it. Very simple and effective. You get a nice 3D button. I set my blending mode to multiply in the following case. Say we have a hero area that needs a headline but white text isn't visible enough. By the way, you should know it's not a good idea to use a different color besides white. There are very few limited extreme cases where another color is optimal, but as a rule of thumb, white is your safest choice. So here we're going to go for a drop shadow, black at a 90-degree angle with a 1 pixel distance and 3 to 4 pixels for its size. And now the text is far more readable. Toggle the effect on and off to see the difference. The opacity of the drop shadow varies quite a lot according to your background, but keep in mind it should be subtle. By having it set to multiply, this allows us to replace the image and still get a pretty good result. If we kept it at normal and a certain color, it would have lost its flexibility. That's because black on multiply goes well on nearly everything. In our previous example, we used a darker shade of yellow. That's very specific to a particular scenario and doesn't allow us to easily swap out the image with another without making other changes. This is our bread and butter use of our drop shadow. Headlines and subheadlines in the hero area. Buttons come in far in second place, but let's discuss them too. So let's continue with this, drop shadows for the text inside a call to action button. Here I switch up between 90 and minus 90 degrees. The latter one is quite interesting and it works like this. It needs a darker color than we have for our button, 1 pixel in size and a few pixels in distance. The opacity should be fairly strong. And this is our result. It's nothing too spectacular, but like I always say, little details make a big difference. One thing to note is that you should never use drop shadow for paragraphs of text. For headlines and subheadlines that's fine, but never on smaller text. It makes it look very dirty and fuzzy. Another big aspect of the drop shadow effect is to never rely on it for intricate or realistic shadows. Meaning if you have a complex object and you want a nice shadow for it, a layer style isn't going to be enough. I'm going to use this random image. This is a picture of Miranda Kerr taken from DeviantArt from the user VSAngel. This is a transparent image and it will serve our purpose. If we try to add a regular drop shadow through the layer style alone, that won't be enough. As you can see, the result is less than ideal, it's just not realistic. I'm sure some Photoshop Pro could achieve a decent effect by using the contour option, but it's not optimal. I'm here to teach you real-world applications through which you work fast and get results immediately. So drop shadow alone isn't okay here. Let me show you how I'd do it, even though that's not the goal of this video. We'll start off with a drop shadow and we'll click and hold on the canvas. This will make the drop shadow move, and as you can see in the settings, the distance value has changed. We can adjust the size if we want to, and I'd say 10 pixels works fine. Press OK, right-click on the layer effect in the Layers panel, and choose Create Layer. A warning will show up, but you can ignore it, just press OK, and now we have our shadow in another layer. To make it more realistic, we'll add some perspective to it by using Ctrl-T on our new layer. Then hold Ctrl and click and hold on the center anchor. Move it somewhere towards the ground and make sure you align it with her feet. You can also hold Ctrl on any other anchor in order to free transform the layer. Then when you're happy, just hit Enter. Now you can add a layer mask from the bottom of the Layers panel. Now get the Gradient tool and swipe a few times until you're happy. You can also drop the opacity to a lower value, maybe feather it. You get the idea. We can perform several actions to get a better shadow. This is miles away from the initial drop shadow effect, so to sum it up, don't try to use it for anything too complicated by itself. Okay, let's move on. There's only so few elements in modern web design that allow you to use drop shadows, and the way to use it has changed with this new flat design trend. What has emerged is a new thing called long shadow. I'm not sure if this is going to catch on seriously or not, but I thought I should mention it while we're on the subject. Instead of teaching you how to create a long shadow effect, I'm going to point you to this website. From here, you can download a plugin that will automatically create a nice long shadow effect. I'll move this button to a new tab to demonstrate it. You simply select the layer you want and click on Generate. You can obviously play around a lot with the settings, but it's very easy to get. And the results are pretty good as well, considering it takes no time at all. One thing to note is that if you don't want to use the plugins, these shadows can be done in several ways, yet all of them are time-consuming. So keep that in mind and use this plugin or pre-made actions that can simplify your life. And with that, we're going to be moving on to other layer styles. Stroke. The stroke effect is one of my go-to layer styles in most of my projects. I love it because it's versatile and it gives me loads of options when I combine it with other effects. Let's take a button. The normal approach is to set its position to outside and have it between 1 and 3 pixels. This is pretty much standard. One thing to note is this. When you're using gradients, you can't use the color picker immediately. You have to first commit to the gradients by pressing OK, and only then will the color picker work. So in this example, we have a yellow button, right? We'll add a black gradient just so there's no doubts. Now, if I go back to the stroke and I want to use the color picker to select a color from that gradient, look what happens. We get a yellow stroke, because as far as Photoshop is concerned, the button is still yellow at this point. Since you didn't press OK on the main layer style window, the gradient hasn't been applied yet. This is only a preview you're looking at. Press OK, and then enter the color picker for the stroke again. Now, if we click anywhere on the button, you'll see it picks up the right color. So this is something you should know, and it can save you a lot of embarrassment. To finish my point regarding buttons, this is how I like to use them. First, I'll look for a nice gradient that has a darker side at the bottom. If that's an issue, simply hit reverse and it will be the same thing. Now commit to the gradient and open up the layer style panel again. Select the stroke, set it at 2 pixels and use the color picker to get a nuance from the bottom of the button. You end up with something like this. Combine it with a subtle bevel effect and you're good to go. I've got to warn you that this particular button design isn't all that hot right now. Most designers like to use very simple buttons with little or no effects on them. Nevertheless, you should know that stroke and buttons go hand in hand no matter the current trend. The stroke can also be used to create square checkboxes. Get the rectangle tool and draw a small square. Set the fill to 0%. Go to stroke, set the position to inside, and there you go. You now have this shape that's very useful in sliders found in the hero area. Use them in a combination like this with 2 empty and 1 full and it's perfect. This can mark the current slide in our hero area, for example. We set the position to inside because this gives us perfectly square edges. This doesn't happen if we set it to outside, even if we used a normal rectangle and not a rounded rectangle. Instead of a solid colour, you can use a pattern too, but that's less common. The gradient, though, is very nice. I like to set it at 90 degrees and go to town. This is very versatile, but not only for gradients. This works great for your custom graphics too. I can open up this example we just did, my camera icon, which features quite a few stroke effects. As you can see, I used the stroke with the fill type set to gradient in order to colour my lens. The gradients were all made by me and I'm quite happy with the result. This is what the stroke can do for you. Besides making square empty boxes, the same 0% fill plus stroke technique can be used for icons. This is how you get those nice iOS style ones. You can also use the stroke on some headlines, but be warned that this style is mostly reserved for kid-orientated websites. Here you want to use a generous stroke, way over 5 pixels, and have a fairly bright colour set. You can also duplicate the effect with the use of outer glow like I've done here. And with drop shadow too. All these combined produce quite an interesting result, a triple stroke if you will. So to sum it up, the stroke is versatile. It can be used in several situations and it's great when you want to focus on layer styles rather than using several layers for the same job. Let's move on to gradients, patterns and inner shadows. Gradients are a great tool through which you can add something extra to your designs. Whether you're using it in your buttons or in some custom graphics, the gradient overlay can give you great results. One thing to note is that you can get pre-made gradients from all over the web. Simply Google them and you'll find GRD files that you can double-click and they'll be immediately loaded into Photoshop. I don't recommend you load up too many, especially if your system isn't top of the line. Loading up too many resources can cause Photoshop to lag. With that being said, you should know dramatic gradients are way out of style and you shouldn't use them. Try to have close colours at both ends of it. Going from red to blue is awful, or from any colour to pure white or black. Let's take this button. Let's add a gradient to it. I like to enlarge this window in order to better see more gradients. Here some are washed out, while others near the bottom are quite harsh. Going down a bit more, you can see gradients that have quite a bit of amplitude, meaning the colours are very separated from each other. This causes quite a dramatic effect and this isn't what you want. The newest and best gradients are very subtle, nearly flat. This is why some of them are actually called semi-flat. This is what you're looking for in a gradient. Colours that are in the same region. These produce the best results because they're not in your face. So make sure you stick with these semi-flat ones instead of the dramatic ones you saw up top. Even these ones with a line going through the middle are out of style, so stay away from them too. Now at this point, you may want this particular gradient set I have here. I recommend two things. Either browse around, load several gradients and then start eliminating those that are ugly, or simply create your own. Let me show you that you can do both these actions. To remove a gradient, simply hold Alt and your cursor will change to a scissor. That's it. Now you can click to delete as long as you hold down the Alt key. To create your own, start from the first gradient, which is actually made from your foreground and background colour. Select one of the sliders and open up the colour picker. Once you're happy with a colour, copy its code. Press OK and hit the other side of the gradient. Paste the code in and then finally adjust the colour. I usually like to go for a lighter colour at the top. Press OK and then you can name it as you want. Press New and you'll find it at the end of your gradient set. It's very easy to do. Another thing to note is that you can't stack colour overlay with gradient, or gradients with pattern overlay. These three layer styles don't work together regularly. Colour overlay overwrites, if you will, the other two. Gradient overlay overwrites pattern overlay, so it's 1, 2, 3. Gradients can work great with patterns, but you can't use them normally. For that, you have to change the blending mode or the opacity. I recommend you always adjust the blending mode for the effect that's on top. So in our case, gradient overlay is the one on top. If you go for linear burn, you'll immediately start to see the pattern from underneath. Of course, you can also adjust the opacity, but working with the blending mode is optimal in my view. For gradients, the angle should always be set at 90 degrees. This is the standard and I don't recommend you use anything else. Style, again, linear is the best way to go, especially for buttons. For circles, you may want to use the radial style, but that's one of the very few exceptions. Going to our pattern overlay, things are quite simple here. You have to use subtlepatterns.com. I actually paid for their Photoshop extension and I have to say it's great. Long gone are the days where a simple white background was enough. Now lots of great looking sites feature a pattern on the background, but not any old pattern will do. You need something refined, elegant, that doesn't stand out too much, thus the need for subtle patterns. I'm not affiliated with them, but they have a great plugin. And in case you don't want to pay for the plugin, it's fairly easy to use their website. Simply press on a preview and you can see that pattern in action. Once you're happy, hit download. Then go to Edit, Define Pattern, and you're good to go. While you can find amazing gradients all over the web, patterns that can be easily used in web designs are much harder to come by. Let me show you their plugin in action. So you enable it by going to Window, Extensions, Subtle Patterns. This is what the tab looks like. It loads the latest ones immediately. Then simply press on any one of them and it will be applied as a pattern overlay. Great stuff. Besides backgrounds, there's very few places where you should work with patterns. And if you want to do something different, simply add a colour overlay to give it a nice tint. Remember to either change the blend mode or the colour overlay opacity. Moving on to inner shadow, this has a great place in custom graphics. It's very similar to the stroke in that regard, but besides that use, you can use it in most press states for your buttons or menus. Applying it only takes a few minutes, yet it saves you a lot of trouble down the road when the client figures out they're missing. It's also a nice way of separating yourself from other designers. You'd be surprised to find out how many failed to include these things in their final PSD. Inner shadow should be kept at 90 degrees and on multiply in the case of buttons. In custom graphics, you can adjust it to how you see fit. Also, for pressed states, you can include a 1 to 2 pixel stroke on the inside to further accentuate the fact that the button is down. Lastly, you may want to consider adding a satin effect. 0 degree angle, multiply, size always bigger than the distance. 10 to 40 works pretty well. I don't recommend you use any of these effects on text layers because most of them don't have a CSS equivalent. That means the coder or client won't be able to use your headlines, for example, if you're going to add bevel and a satin effect to it. The only option would be to make the text and image. That's not something that's considered best practice. And that pretty much sums up all the major layer styles you're going to use in your projects. The rest of them can be used in custom graphics, of course, but since those cases vary a lot from project to project, I decided to skip them. That way we can focus on other, more precise things. Let's continue.